Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sports Lock Podcast. I am your host, Ben Mostaller. And this evening, we are breaking down the AFC West. We have done the North, the South, the East, and now we're on to the West. If you're viewing on TikTok here, I'll give you a shout out to answer questions. This is the first time we're doing it. So the people on TikTok will get to see this live before this is posted to Spotify and over to YouTube. So if you want to join for next week's podcast for the NFC North that way, follow me on TikTok at Sports Lock Podcast. So let's go through here. You see the AFC West standings from last year. The Chiefs won at 11-6. The Raiders 8-9. Broncos 8-9. The Chargers 5-12. I had a lot higher expectations for the Chargers last year. Herbert was injured a lot of the season, even though he played through it, which hurt him and the team. So they struggled a lot worse than they should have. I had them a lot higher at 11 wins. I thought the Raiders and the Broncos would be a few games worse, which they weren't. So let's talk about the Denver Broncos out of the AFC West. They go 8-9, third in the division. Their key additions this year are quarterback Zach Wilson of the New York Jets and wide receiver Josh Reynolds from the Detroit Lions. That is kind of the key fantasy pickups there. Obviously, they drafted more talent, but they're going to run it back most likely with Jared Stidham. He's right now their starting quarterback. However, there's rumors that Bo Nix, who they drafted, there's rumors that Zach Wilson could be the starter. So this is going to be a big mini camp and preseason that you're going to see out of these quarterbacks to determine who the starting quarterback is. But as now they're listing Stidham as the quarterback. He started in 2 games last season. He threw for 496 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Not bad in 2 starts. He was on pace to finish as a QB8 if he would have continued out the year. Now, I think fantasy-wise, you got to avoid all of the Denver Broncos quarterbacks. You're not going to want to pick them as a starter or even a backup. I have him right around QB 42. That's where ESPN has him. He's like my QB 35. But I do think they go to almost all of the quarterbacks to try this season. So I just stay away from the Broncos quarterbacks. Their running back, Javonte Williams, finished as the RB29. He played in pretty much every game last season. 774 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 receiving touchdowns. Samaje Perine, I think, is going to get some work as well. And Williams has really been a bust player since he started. So many people were high on Javonte Williams from the start, and he's really disappointed. I don't know if people are going to be on the bandwagon of him again. I think there is some upside, obviously, with no Russell Wilson and no good quarterback play. So they're going to go to Williams a lot more, but he still has a really low floor, which is concerning. I mean, the upside's there, but it could drop really bad. But thank you for the likes here on TikTok. Keep them coming in. Again, if you're watching a little bit later on the podcast on YouTube or over on Spotify, I'm starting going live on TikTok while I make my podcast. And make sure that you go ahead and drop some questions if you have any in the comments below. But anyways, Javonte Williams for me is my RB27, ESPN's RB28. We aren't far off on Javonte Williams at all. Wide receiver Courtland Sutton. He is the star now. They lose out on Jerry Jeudy. He finished wide receiver 35 and was a touchdown hawk. He had 10 of them last year, tied for third, but only 59 receptions for 772 yards. Again, they add Josh Reynolds. But to me, Sutton is a wide receiver that you would want to draft if you're drafting anybody from this team. I mean, Williams will be drafted and somebody's going to take Courtland Sutton, but we don't know what the connection is going to be like yet. I do see him getting closer to maybe 75 to 80 receptions just because he doesn't have that competition there with Jerry Jeudy, but there's no way that he's getting 10 touchdowns. He's my wide receiver 40, ESPN wide receiver 45, so he could be a flex option, but otherwise I really don't want to start him. Finally, tight ends Adam Troutman and Greg Dulcich. Both were injured in 2023, both fighting for a starting spot. I just wouldn't draft any of these guys. I wouldn't even know wouldn't even know who to tell you to draft, to be honest with you. Their defense, they're just mid. They do have decent quarterback options to go to, nothing amazing. But when you have Bo Nix and then Zach Wilson as the third string, he was starting, of course, last year in the presence of the injured Aaron Rodgers. So he has that experience. So not bad as a backup. They do have bad defense, and the loss of Russell Wilson is concerning. But last year they go 8-9. I projected 6-11. This year I think they go 5-12. I think they struggle, and they have a pretty rough schedule ahead. Let's talk about the Super Bowl champs, the Kansas City Chiefs. 11-6 last year, won them the division and the back-to-back Super Bowls. And their key addition was Hollywood Brown from the Arizona Cardinals. Now let's talk about Patrick Mahomes, who had his worst season to date. That's why I put up here on TikTok the decline of Mahomes. Anyways, he still finishes the QB8. Mahomes' touchdown numbers were down, but the interceptions were up. And this was expected, I believe, because of the poor wide receivers that were on the team. This year, he's still a talented quarterback, one of the best to ever play. And the wide receiver core does get a little bit better, but there is concern about Rashee Rice, who we're going to get to in a minute. But adding Marquise Brown, a little bit of an upgrade there. So he's my QB3, ESPN QB3. I could see him easily finishing close to where he was last year, putting up those types of numbers. But you have to respect what he's done so far, and a Super Bowl winning quarterback. You have to give it to him. So for that, he's not really a QB1 anymore. But anywhere from QB3, I think, to QB6, he'll go somewhere in that range. Running back Isaiah Pacheco finishes the RB15 last year in 14 games, finishing just under 1,000 yards and added 9 total touchdowns. If he started, he was on pace to finish as the RB8. I think easily this year they're going to utilize him more. I know they have Clyde Edwards-Helaire, but Pacheco's the guy. I think he'll easily have over 1,000 rushing yards and double-digit touchdowns. So for that, he's my RB9. ESPN has him at RB8. I see him right around the Derrick Henry range. I do think there's a little bit of upside there, but not a ton. I don't think he finishes as a top 5 running back, but right around RB10 is where I think he will go and where he will finish. Now let's talk about the wide receivers, because there's a lot of controversy with Rashee Rice, who got himself in a little bit of trouble here, and he could be suspended. We don't know for how long that will last. We don't know what the suspension is. So that could be huge, and we're waiting on that announcement to determine any sort of rankings or anything like that. But if we base it off of last year, he finishes a wide receiver 27 with 79 receptions, 938 yards, and 7 touchdowns. He got hot late and seemed to be the guy. Brown, now they add Marquise Brown, and you see I have here on TikTok Sleeper Brown. Well, Marquise finished as the wide receiver 50 with 51 receptions, 574 yards, and 4 touchdowns in that very poor Arizona Cardinals offense. They also drafted Xavier Worthy, who I think is a sleeper to watch out for. He is very fast. He's going to go to the deep ball. So he is somebody later on you might want to draft. Now, if Rashee Rice faces a minimum of a maximum of 3 or 4 games, I'd still draft him right around his ADP, maybe a round or so lower. But it's very hard to rank him right now. Right now, he's my wide receiver 30, but that could easily go up if he plays the whole season. It could easily go down if it's at least a 5-game suspension. ESPN has him wide receiver 35. Now, Marquise Brown, I think, has huge upside because he's going to be the one to get the targets if Rashee Rice is going to miss some time, and we expect that he will. He's my wide receiver 35, ESPN wide receiver 40. But again, that could change depending on what happens to Rashee Rice. But I do think that Marquise Brown is a huge sleeper this season. How about tight end Travis Kelce? Not much to say about him, but he's one of the best. Last year, though, he finished tight end 3, which was his worst season since 2015. But he still hasn't finished outside of the top 3 since 2016 as a tight end in fantasy football. That is insane. That is incredible. He's one of the best tight ends, if not the best tight end to ever play. And this year, you have to draft him at number 1. There's nothing to tell you not to. I mean, you could base it off of last year, missing 2 games and maybe a decline of Patrick Mahomes. But if you don't have that, I mean, he's easily the tight end 1. He's been Mr. Reliable since 2016, finishing in the top 3. So you have to draft him there. I know a lot of people might look at Andrews or Laporta or guys like that, but it's got to be Travis Kelce first. Now, I think we are finally getting to a spot where we're a little bit deeper at the tight end position, and I think there's a lot more equal guys. So I don't think you take Travis Kelce extremely early because you get good value outside of him now. But of course, as soon as Travis Kelce goes, some tight ends will come off the board. Their defense was top 15. The pros are they still have the same amazing offense back, and they're coming off back-to-back Super Bowl wins. The cons are is Mahomes what we saw last year? I know he still won a Super Bowl, but fantasy number wise, is this a little bit of a decline? I don't know. We'll see. But last year they go 11-6. I projected 13-4. They don't really have a tough schedule. I think they're easily going to go 14-3. I think they can. I know that's crazy, but I think they can bounce back with the addition of Marquise Brown, some healthy guys, drafting a better defense. I think that they're going to be a force to reckon with in the AFC, along with the Ravens. Next, we go to the Las Vegas Raiders, who went 8-9, second in the division. Their key additions were Gardner Minshew, and they drafted 13th overall tight end Brock Bowers, who we'll get to in a minute. But right now, they're saying their starter quarterback is Aiden O'Connell. He finished QB 29 with 2,218 yards, 12 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. That was in 10 games. He was on track to finish QB 20 if healthy and playing in all the games. Minshew finished QB 21 with 3,305 yards and 18 total touchdowns. Right now, O'Connell listed as a starter, but I could easily see Minshew taking over and even starting the season. With that, they're both sitting outside of my top 30, 2 guys that you're not going to be drafting, but maybe whoever decides to blow up or be the starter, they might be a waiver wire find. Talk about Zamir White. White will now be the starter with Jacobs out. As a starter last year, he averaged a whopping 99 yards per carry, but only 1 touchdown in those 4 games. But that's insane how 99 yards per carry. He was on track to finish with over 1,600 rushing yards. He was on pace to finish as the RB18, but if you give him way more touchdowns, which you expect, he would be easily a top 5 running back. Now, they do have Alexander Madison, who they picked up, and Amir Abdullah is still there. But Zamir White's the guy that they're going to go with. He has a lot of upside from the games that we saw. The question is, can he score touchdowns? This offense is going to be pathetic. I think they're going to be down a lot and passing the ball a lot. So that's going to be my only concern with Zamir White. And you might say, you're saying he's a top 10 running back here or a big sleeper. But I have him ranked 1 spot below ESPN. I'm very conservative with that. I think that he could easily move up the ranks if we see him do well in the preseason. He's my RB22, RB21. I think he has the most upside out of any running back taken in that range. So I would not mind at all taking a risk on Zamir White this season, especially if he's averaging 99 yards per carry like he did in the 4 games started last year. Wide receiver Devontae Adams finished as a wide receiver 10 last year with 103 receptions, over 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns. Devontae Adams is Devontae Adams, one of the best. And with Aiden O'Connell, I wanted to take a look at those games, especially because he's probably the potential starter. Adams averaged 6 receptions, 68 yards, and about a half touchdown per game. These numbers go with pretty much how he finished. If you add those up, it's right around the same receptions, yards, and touchdowns. So that was great to see. No matter who the quarterback is, I think Adams is due to have another big season. He's going to be the guy. Just like CeeDee Lamb is in Dallas, it's going to be Devontae Adams in Las Vegas. But, of course, they don't have a quarterback like Dak Prescott. However, they're going to be throwing to him a lot. So he's my wide receiver 7. I have him a lot higher than ESPN does at wide receiver 11. But people are going to draft him, I think, a little bit further up because he's just a safe pick, in my opinion. Tight end Brock Bowers, surprised that the Raiders drafted him because they went and got Michael Mayer last year in the second round. But Bowers finished last year with 56 receptions, 714 yards, and 6 touchdowns in college. This would have been best for tight end 10 in the NFL. Now, I think he's going to get a lot of targets outside of Adams. It's just going to really be those two. But there's a really low floor for him. He's a rookie tight end coming in on this team. They thought the same for Mayer last year. He would break out, but he didn't. So conservatively, he's my tight end 15. ESPN has him tight end 12. I do think that he does have some upside, but the floor is just really low on Brock Bowers. Finally, their defense, top 10, surprisingly. They have a high ceiling on offense and defense, but the cons are that they really didn't draft that well. Last year, they go 8-9, projected 5-12. I think they go one worse at 7-10. And lastly, we get to the Los Angeles Chargers, who are a surprising 5-12 and last in the division last year. Their worst record since 2015. Now, what do? They go out and get both kind of injury-prone running backs from the Ravens and J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards, and they pick up tight end Will Dissly from the Seattle Seahawks. Now, Justin Herbert, the last few years, if you've been following the podcast and watching the TikToks, he's been my guy. But this year, with this wide receiver core, it's going to be hard for him to be that guy. He finished QB 17 last year in 13 games with over 3,000 passing yards, 20 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. He also had 3 rushing touchdowns. He was on pace to finish as the QB 8 if he was healthy the whole season. However, we talk about them losing Keenan Allen. They lose Mike Williams, and now you have a really poor wide receiver core. How are Herbert favorite? I think he'll be right around where he was last year, even if he plays a full season. I think he's right around QB 16. He's a very, very talented quarterback, but he sits right outside the top 15 for me. And he's a guy that is a solid backup because of his talent. But how will he connect with his new wide receivers? That'll be, we'll have to wait to see. We talk about the injured running backs that they pick up. Last year, Edwards did, though, finish as the RB25, and he was tied third for the most rushing touchdowns with 13, 810 yards to add to it. So right now they do have Gus Edwards as the starter, but I think it's going to be a shared backfield. They did that even with Austin Eckler there. And Austin Eckler, in my opinion, is one of the best running backs in the league. So now you bring these two in, they're going to use them kind of like how they did in Baltimore. So Edwards, for me, is RB36, ESPN RB41. I do think he gets about 7 rushing touchdowns, 6 or 7. J.K. Dobbins, for me, is right around where ESPN has him at RB43. I just think he's been hurt more than Edwards, which is really concerning. Let's talk about these wide receivers. You have Joshua Palmer, who's technically the wide receiver 1, Quentin Johnson, who's coming back as well, and they draft Ladd McConkey out of Georgia in the second round. Now, Palmer and Johnson, very similar in numbers. Wide receiver 61, wide receiver 70. Both had 38 receptions. Palmer did have roughly about 150 more receiving yards, but they both had 2 touchdowns. This year, it's really hard to say who's going to be the wide receiver 1. You expect that it's going to be Palmer or Johnston on the team, but who do you pick? For me, McConkey has the most upside. Wide receiver 44 right now is what ESPN has him, but I have them all outside wide receiver 50. I think it's going to be really tough, especially in a 10-man league, for any of these guys to get drafted. So with that being said, I personally am not drafting any of these guys until I see something happen, but you want to keep an eye on all 3 of them because easily any of them could be the wide receiver 1, and whoever breaks out as a wide receiver 1 will have a big season. Tight end Will Dissly, he struggled last year and comes in to compete with Hayden Hurst and Donald Parham Jr. I would say don't draft any Los Angeles Charger tight end. None of them are going to be drafted, none as a backup. Again, look at the waiver wire. Their defense was bad last year. They have a great starting quarterback, which is a pro, and I know that he can lead them and do very well, but they have a brand new offense with pretty much new wide receivers stepping up into a big role. And of course, 2 new running backs, and they have a bad defense, which doesn't bode well. So the Chargers a few years ago, We would have loved to see them do well, and we expected that, but this year I don't expect it, especially Harbaugh's first season. Last year 5-12, projected 11-6. This year I'm even going worse at 4-13. So now the AFC West sleepers and busts. I'll be honest with you. I think there's a lot of people in the AFC West that are properly rated according to ESPN. I don't have any busts at their ADP, but sleepers, I like Zamir White that could break out, Marquise Brown and Brock Bowers, which I talked to you why I think those guys could have a great season. And finally, my 2024 AFC West predictions: Chiefs 14-3, Raiders 7-10, Broncos 5-12, and the Chargers 4-13. That's all for the podcast tonight. Thank you for those that watched here over on TikTok. It looks like we have 201 likes and roughly about that many views, which is awesome there. If you're not watching on TikTok, make sure to go on next week. I'll try to post something on my Instagram to let you know when I'm going to be recording the podcast. But follow on Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at Sports Locker Podcast for all fantasy football advice and updates. So thank you on TikTok. Thank you here for the support. Make sure to like and share. And I'll see you guys next week for the NFC North, which looks to be an exciting talk with the Lions and the Packers. We'll see you guys next week. Enjoy the rest of your week.